Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
We try to entertain you week in and week out, but lo and behold, Anthony talks first. So you're going to have to sit through this.
Last week, a New Yorker, Quentin Quarantino, was concerned about people getting left behind as the U.S. pulls out of Afghanistan. So this guy launches a GoFundMe campaign to raise money to fly at-risk Afghanis out. Within 2 hours, the campaign raised more than $500,000. Within 24 hours, it had raised $6 million from 115,000 donors. Americans tend to be too hard on themselves. It's popular to talk about how Americans are greedy and always looking out for themselves, but the data don't bear this out. And Mr. Quarantino is just one example. Let me quote you some data from the National Philanthropic Trust. In 2019, Americans gave $450 billion to charities. Gave it. 70% of that came not from corporations, not from big foundations, but from individuals. Individual Americans gave away almost $500 billion to charity in just 1 year.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, but it's not the end. While we're quick to excoriate the rich, more than 90% of high net worth Americans gave to charity. When I say this to people, many come back with the criticism, well, the rich only give to charity so they can deduct it off their taxes. That criticism reveals a fatal misunderstanding as to how taxes work. Deducting a charitable contribution does not make you better off. It simply makes you a little bit less worse off.
I'm with you on this one. For some reason, nobody can bother to understand this. It's not like the government just overlooks the money that you give out in charity.
Yeah, if the rich are truly greedy, they wouldn't give to charity at all. They'd be much better off.
That's right.
So where did our $500 billion in charity go? The top 4 recipients were religious organizations, which received about 30% of our giving, and they in turn spend much of that helping the poor. 14% of our giving went to education, 12% to human services, 12% to grant-making foundations, and 10% to healthcare organizations. But that's not the end of it. A quarter of American adults volunteered 9 billion hours of their time.
Holy hell.
Yeah, I know. Worth about $200 billion.
In minimum wage alone, that's a fortune.
I know. It's astounding. The volunteer hours went to raising money for charitable causes, collecting and distributing food and clothing to the needy, and mentoring young people. Add it all up, and Americans just last year voluntarily gave away $650 billion in time and treasure. It's even more astounding when you think about what the federal government does to help the poor. The government provides health care for the poor, health insurance for children, it subsidizes health insurance for adults, it provides monetary payments to low and middle income families, it provides supplemental income for the elderly and disabled, unemployment insurance, food assistance, school meals, housing assistance, child care assistance, home energy assistance, and programs to help abused and neglected children. Add up all of that, and the federal government spent on all those programs combined $792 billion last year.
Geez, we're right in the neighborhood, aren't we?
It's just 20% more than what Americans gave away. So in terms of ballpark numbers, Americans are voluntarily giving away as much as the federal government spends on all of its welfare programs combined.
And imagine what they might give if they didn't labor under the yoke of taxation all the time.
Yeah, exactly so.
Take all of these things out, and all of a sudden the tax liability is going to be lower, and people have even more money to give away. And I want to switch gears. I want to talk about taxes and the pandemic, because a very interesting thing hit my news feed today. The headline tells the tale. The pandemic has most Americans paying no federal income taxes.
Well, most Americans weren't paying federal income taxes before the pandemic.
Well, yeah, I didn't want to get into that because you and I have written about that a number of times, right? And if you include transfer payments, which you should, most Americans are net takers, not net givers. But even if we don't think of it that way, nobody's paying federal income tax. Why not? Because they're not working.
Yeah.
And they haven't worked all year. We've got this profligate spending on the part of the federal government. It's literally worse now than it has ever been in the past. I say that each and every year. And I can guarantee you that it'll be worse next year than it is this. This leaves us in a very dangerous position. Spending has spiked, and now there's not going to be any income for the beast to devour. That's going to have a palpable effect on our deficits moving forward, where you and I used to say idiotic things like $1 trillion deficits are going to be the new normal. I mean, we barely sat down and it's 3.5. It's going to be 5 next year. You heard it here first. I'd bet anybody it's going to be 5 next year. I predict that it'll be so ridiculous, so out of hand, that people won't even be able to accurately calculate what the deficit is.
When people don't work, we don't produce things. I don't know if you're seeing this where you are, but I'm noticing shortages of all manner of things. You go into the grocery store and there are fewer things there. I mean, it's not bare by any means, but there's fewer things than usual. I went to look to buy a bike the other day. Talked to the guy, and the guy said, "Oh no, there's a shortage everywhere of bikes. You just can't find them. It's going to be 6 months to a year." This keeps popping up time and time again over a broad spectrum of goods. And this is what happens when people stop working. Well, we're not producing things. Of course there are shortages.
Right. And I would tell you to go buy a used bike. It's like buying a used car. It's way cheaper.
Yeah, I discovered that. Yeah.
Functionally the same thing. The last bike I bought was on Facebook Marketplace, right? Nice and easy. But, Ant, we have to carve out some time here for the foolishness of the week. I don't recall ever having one like we've got this week. I'm going to take a Tennessee pastor to task. Do I want to call him stupid? Yeah, I do. He has decided that anybody who's wearing a mask inside of his church needs to leave.
He's kicking people out for wearing masks.
That is correct. He says that he won't have it in his church. Look, I'm a bit of a freedom guy, and I know you are too. And if somebody wants to wear a mask in my presence, I go straight back to Thomas Jefferson. That neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Knock yourself out. If people wanted some kind of tax that would have me paying for the masks, not interested, et cetera, et cetera. But this jackwagon looks out at a congregation and sees people wearing masks because, you go to church, and that's probably a high contact area, and he will not allow it. I don't know what to say about that. I don't have a lot of skin in the game with pastors, but I kind of hope the market teaches him a lesson and shuts him right down. Do I think people should wear masks? I'm ambivalent. If you want to, go ahead. If you don't want to, fine. Am I wearing one? No. Everybody's had sufficient opportunity to get vaccinated. It's your call. Wear masks or don't. I don't really care one way or the other. I do think you're funny if you're driving down the road all by yourself in the car and you're wearing a mask, something that I see at least once a day. But, what can you do?
Did you see the advertisement aimed at people who wear masks in their cars all by themselves? They're by themselves in the car with the mask. The advertisement is for the seatbelt that you put around yourself when you're walking.
That's actually kind of fantastic. I like to see that. Look that up later.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. This week, Clark Neily joins us. Clark is Vice President of Criminal Justice at the Cato Institute. His areas of interest include constitutional law, overcriminalization, civil forfeiture, police accountability, and gun rights. Clark is author of Terms of Engagement, How Our Courts Should Enforce the Constitution's Promise of Limited Government. Clark, welcome back to Words and Numbers.
Nice to be back. Thank you.
A couple of episodes ago, as part of my quick hit, I pulled some information about the CDC and moratoriums on evictions, and the more I looked into it, the madder I got about it, and the more I thought that we need an expert to come on. So let me just lay out for our listeners what I understand to be what's happened so far, and correct me where I'm wrong. About this time last year, the CDC imposed a moratorium on evictions that was to run till the end of 2020. This criminalized the eviction of any renter the CDC deemed coverable, and I take coverable to mean that the person was in some area that was particularly hard hit with COVID. The moratorium was supposed to expire at the end of 2020, but throughout 2021, the CDC extended this moratorium multiple times. Meanwhile, 5 federal courts and an appellate panel of the Sixth Circuit Court ruled that the CDC had exceeded its authority in issuing the moratoriums. Then, in June of this year, 5 Supreme Court justices allowed the moratorium to stand until it was set to expire on July 31. But Justice Kavanaugh said, quote, "In my view, clear and specific congressional authorization would be necessary for the CDC to extend the moratorium past July 31. So that's where we are. Then, early August, the CDC extended the moratorium again to the end of October. Now, if I'm reading all of this correctly, and again, that's why I asked you to come on to verify this, it looks as if the courts right up through the federal level have said that the CDC does not have authority to issue these orders. The Supreme Court seems to have said something along those lines, and yet the executive branch is just ignoring them. What gives here?
Well, let's start with this. The Supreme Court had an opportunity to categorically say that the CDC has exceeded its legal authority and does not have the power to enforce the current eviction moratorium. The court didn't do that. And so there is no enforceable court order on the books that prevents the CDC from enforcing this moratorium. So what you really have, I think, in a sense, is a presidential administration that has decided that it is prepared in some sense to play chicken with the judiciary over the question of whether the CDC has the legal authority to continue enforcing this eviction moratorium in light of the signals, but again, not legally enforceable order, but merely signals that the Supreme Court has offered to this point. Look, I think it won't surprise any of your readers to hear me say that if you are a betting person, if you're a betting president, for example, and the question is, will the Supreme Court punk out and allow you to enforce an illegal and or unconstitutional mandate of this kind, it's usually a safe bet to say yeah.
All right, so you've said something that really disturbed me. You said there was no specific order from the Supreme Court for the CDC to stop issuing the moratorium. Therefore, the executive branch just assumed that the CDC has the authority. In other words, the default is the CDC has the authority unless the Supreme Court says otherwise. So that's one thing that bothers me. The second thing that bothers me is federal courts, so this is one level down from the Supreme Court, have said multiple times that the CDC does not have this authority. Does the executive branch consider itself immune from federal courts for some reason?
No, but the Justice Department has been doing an effective job of kind of jockeying for position in the lower courts, getting courts to either not issue an enforceable order or to vacate the order. So there is no legally enforceable order at any level of the judiciary presently that would prevent the federal government from enforcing this eviction moratorium. So to my knowledge, there's no argument that the federal government is acting in violation of an applicable court order. Again, because the Justice Department has been very effective, as they often are, at persuading the judiciary to not let these orders go into effect until the Supreme Court has definitively weighed in, which, as you pointed out, it had the opportunity to do back in the end of June, but didn't.
All right. Then the whole situation is not at the DEFCON level that I thought it was.
Well, no, not in the sense. We do not have a federal agency acting in open defiance of an enforceable court order. We don't have that. So what we do have, which I would say is nearly as concerning, is a president who has expressed his belief or his understanding that the action of a federal agency nominally subject to his control, the Centers for Disease Control, is enforcing a regulation that his legal advisors have told him probably does not pass constitutional muster. And of course, he as President Biden, has an independent obligation to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. He took an oath to do that. In principle, he is supposed to form an independent conclusion on his own part about the legality, the constitutionality of whatever the government is doing, in this case, enforcing this eviction moratorium. And if he personally concludes that it's not constitutionally permissible, then he can and also has a duty to prevent executive branch officials under his control from violating the Constitution. Now, he hasn't gone quite so far as to say that he thinks that the CDC is violating the Constitution. He simply expressed the view that scholars that he's consulted with will say that the Supreme Court will probably conclude, ultimately, that the CDC lacks the authority to enforce this extended moratorium. Let me be clear, that's why I say this is a rather unseemly game of separation of powers chicken, where the president has more or less disclaimed any obligation to live up to his constitutional oath. He's been coy, right? He hasn't really told us whether he thinks the current moratorium is constitutional or unconstitutional, but he's made really clear that he intends to punt that question over to the Supreme Court, where his advisors have told him that they should expect to lose. And I think that's probably right.
So ultimately, we can lay the blame for all of this at the feet of Congress. Congress could have just enacted legislation imposing the moratorium, but instead it passed its authority on to the CDC, or rather didn't even pass its authority on to the CDC, just sat back while the CDC took action where Congress should have instead.
That's probably right. Look, you've got a fundamentally feckless Congress that should be the one to step up and take the political consequences of extending this moratorium. They were the ones to initially enact it. In my view, they should have been the body that was driving this train all along. But there's an increasing tendency for Congress to try to slough off onto the unappointed bureaucrats of the administrative branch potentially volatile, high-stakes decisions of this kind, so that Congress doesn't have to endure the electoral accountability that the Constitution intends them to have. So in a sense, it's kind of a win-win-win for all of the feckless political actors who don't want to have to own up to the constitutional accountability that they are supposed to. And it's unseemly, it's unfortunate, and it's, I think, a real concern for our form of government. It's not anything that we should be happy about.
The topic so far is focusing on this moratorium, but there's something more subtle and possibly more disturbing going on, and that is that there is a contract between the landlord and the renter, and this moratorium steps in and breaks that contract, effectively after the fact altering the terms of the thing. And that alone, the altering of the terms of the contract by fiat, sets a very disturbing precedent.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. There's actually a 1934 case called Home Building and Loan Association v. Blaisdell, which is actually somewhat similar. This was during the Great Depression. And what happened in a nutshell was that the state of Minnesota effectively altered the duration during which the holder of a mortgage, a bank, could foreclose on a loan, or they gave the property owner more time before the mortgagor could foreclose on the loan. So this was a very clear alteration of the terms of an otherwise enforceable contract. And of course, we have a whole provision in the Constitution that says that no state shall impair the obligation of contracts. One might have thought that that would violate that provision. Of course, it did violate that provision, but the Supreme Court in its infinite wisdom said, in effect, well, we have this national emergency going on, and that gives both state legislatures and us the authority to kind of wink at constitutional provisions that prevent the government from reacting in whatever way they think most suited to addressing this emergency. The irony, of course, was that the provision that the Supreme Court allowed the state legislature to violate was one that was put in the Constitution, the so-called Contracts Clause, precisely to discourage state legislatures from fiddling around with private loans, because this is what happened in the wake of the Revolution. There were a lot of farms being foreclosed after the farmers went off to fight the Revolution, and there was attempts by people who had received loans to essentially try to use the legislature to renegotiate the terms of those loans. So it's rather ironic that this provision was put into the Constitution for the precise scenario that arose during the Great Depression, and the Supreme Court just pushed that to one side and said, well, it's an emergency, so the state legislature gets to do what it wants. And that's pretty much exactly what we've seen here so far with the CDC's extension of the eviction moratorium.
But what's bothering me more about this is that it's the CDC. This is a bunch of unelected bureaucrats that all of a sudden are issuing edicts that are breaking private contracts that people joined voluntarily.
That should bother you. I half-jokingly refer to this as the give a mouse a cookie form of government here, because Congress and the Supreme Court has been ceding authority to unelected bureaucrats incrementally for decades. And we've really gotten to the point now where the question isn't so much whether it's permissible or impermissible for Congress to delegate its policymaking authority that the Constitution grants to Congress and Congress alone. The only real question is, are there any enforceable limits? Is there anything that Congress could do by way of delegating its legislative authority to an administrative body that the so far somnolent judiciary would push back on and say, no, that's too much? And I think this case could be a test of that. This is not some agency filling in the blanks on an otherwise well-articulated and fully built-out legislative policy. This is a CDC using a rather obscure law that empowers it to enforce such regulations as, in its judgment, are necessary to prevent the transmission and spread of a communicable disease, to just effectively take control of whatever part of the economy it sees fit. And I just can't see how anybody could embrace that interpretation of the federal law that purported to delegate that authority, because at the end of the day, you do run into this question: what couldn't the CDC do under that grant of statutory authority? I don't see anything.
I'm sure you remember a few years ago, whenever it was, that the CDC stepped out and decided it had the authority to comment on what it perceived to be a gun violence problem in the United States. And it was surely positioning itself to become the regulator of guns. They got a little bit of slap back on that, but you could see where maybe they wouldn't have. And this just seems to be in their ethos. They seem to think that they can regulate anything they put their mind to.
Well, I think that's right. I'm not sure why they would think otherwise when they look at what the courts allow them to get away with. I think the only question is,
that's right,
are they moving incrementally enough? I think there's a world of difference between taking a giant step in this kind of game of Supreme Court may I versus taking 5 incremental steps to get to the same place. And I think the government has proved quite effective at expanding the scope of its power as long as it does so in a series of sufficiently incremental steps. And or, as with Obamacare, if it wants to move all at once, then it really has to kind of go for broke. You decide to take over 1/5 or 1/6 of the economy effectively by regulating the national market for healthcare, and then you kind of dare the Supreme Court to say, no, you can't do that. And of course, we know how that turned out.
But the most pernicious part of all of this, and I think it's deeply pernicious at every turn, but what ends up happening is that we get all kinds of things at the federal government level that are unchecked and uncheckable. There's no way to roll it back or to see elections as some sort of institution that might hold their feet to the fire.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And the sheer volume of regulation that pours out of these dozens and hundreds of federal administrative agencies is mind-boggling. There's something like 5,000 congressionally enacted federal crimes and 300,000 criminal regulations. In other words, criminal acts that are declared to be such not by a theoretically democratically accountable body, but just by some faceless bureaucrat in the bowels of some alphabet soup agency on the National Mall. And you can go to prison for engaging in conduct that no legislator ever said was impermissible. And it's absolutely a rolling disaster.
So there are multiple problems here, all of which bother me. The question of whether this is constitutional to begin with, but I think we're even past that. Then you've got the problem of an unelected bureaucracy imposing these rules. And now, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm realizing there's a third problem, which is this particular unelected bureaucracy, the CDC, as you said, is charged with, amongst other things, preventing the spread of disease. That's its goal. Nowhere does it have the goal of balancing the preventing the spread of disease with other things. And so if you hand dictatorial power to this organization, what's it going to do? Just say, okay, we're going to shut down the economy because, well, that's the best way to prevent disease. They are not capable of considering the other side of it. There are a bunch of people who are rightly so focused on medicine and disease. They aren't economists. They don't understand the impact of what they're doing on business, and so are then incapable of understanding the potential costs to what they're doing.
I don't want to be the skunk at the garden party here, but I don't think there's even a constitutional grant for the CDC to exist.
To exist in the first place.
I think the very idea of the CDC is beyond constitutionality.
All right, let's tackle those in reverse order. One of my favorite things to do when I give presentations for the Federalist Society is I like to ask the audience, which tends to be right of center and libertarian types, To just quickly estimate what percentage of the federal government is unconstitutional because not plausibly within the powers delegated to the federal government by the Constitution. And the consensus figure has been a remarkably consistent 80%, 80%. So
that is very Pollyannish.
That may be, right? That might be low.
Yeah.
So you've got things like the U.S. Department of Education. There's not a shred of constitutional authority for that agency to exist, and we could go on down the list. I think that you can make a pretty strong case that most of what the Centers for Disease Control do is not plausibly within a constitutionally enumerated power. They try to hang their hat on things like, well, we're talking about people or articles of commerce moving between states. But then if you actually peel back the layers of the onion, what you discover is that a significant amount of their activity and their regulations don't have anything to do with people or articles moving between states. They regulate purely at the local level. So I think there's a very fair point there that to a pretty high degree of certainty, a substantial amount of what the CDC does is not within any of the constitutionally delegated powers that the federal government possesses. And then the further point that Ant makes is no sane person would delegate to the CDC those kinds of powers because, as you point out, it neither has the political accountability nor the administrative capability of making the sort of balancing decisions that really only a legislature ought to be making. And the CDC could very easily pursue an agenda of trying to dial down the number of COVID-related deaths to zero, even if that entails, for example, shutting down supermarkets so that everybody starves to death.
Right.
That's a pretty dystopian perspective, but that's what you're getting at with this balancing point. I take it, and I think it's an entirely valid point.
Just to pile on to my list of grievances, this particular edict, the moratorium, breaks private contracts. You have a contract between the landlord and the renter. The CDC has basically stepped in and said, all right, we're altering the terms of this thing. So let me phrase it a question. Do you think that this will empower, incite other agencies of unelected bureaucrats to start interfering in other sorts of contracts? For example, what if the Department of Education decides that private student loans are too onerous and so just steps in and says, okay, you students who took loans from banks, you no longer owe any money?
I don't know the answer to that question because my perception is that there is not a sufficiently small unit of time to convey the amount of time that federal agencies spend thinking or worrying about things like you just described. They don't think about that. They don't care. I think by and large, they just focus on what they think would be good policy. And when it comes to, are we going to get away with this? Is this something the courts will uphold or strike down? Is this consistent or inconsistent with the Constitution? Again, I don't think there's a unit of time so small that it would be able to measure the amount of time they spend thinking about it. It's either zero or so close to zero that you couldn't hit the button on the stopwatch fast enough. They don't care.
The shocking thing here is that we're looking at rents, and okay, I get it. But the landlords have mortgages to keep, and they're going to be in default. And why are the same protections not being afforded them? And that's, I think, a fair enough question. Now, I don't think that any of these things should happen. But if it's good enough to protect the renter, why is it not also good enough to protect the landlord?
Well, that's exactly right. Go back to the 1934 Blaisdell case that I mentioned before. If you wanted to figure out the way that you could do the most harm to farmers and other would-be property owners, just come up with a way to make lenders feel insecure in the loans that they're offering. Because now what are you going to do? If you're not sure you're going to be able to foreclose on that property when the farmer stops paying his mortgage, you're going to charge more interest, and fewer farmers are going to be able to get loans, and they're going to be harder to pay off the loans that they do get. And I would say that the same kind of cascade of unintended consequences are easy to predict with the CDC policy, where you're going to have fewer people willing to rent property. They're going to rent on less favorable terms, and they're always going to be thinking about what happens the next time there's a national emergency and some bureaucrat decides that I got to be the one without a seat when the music stops. To hell with that. Double your rent.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you're talking about that, I'm thinking through possible unintended consequences. And one is that moving forward, landlords start requiring the first year up front. And if that means that the renter has to go get a loan to put that money down, well, that's going to be the way it is.
And look, even if we were to credit the existence of the CDC, some legitimacy to the congressional delegation of power to give it extraordinary administrative authority to try to reduce the spread of communicable diseases. And I get that for many of our listeners, and I'm sure for James, that those things are contestable at best. But even if we were to grant all that, there would still be an incredibly powerful argument to try to circumscribe the scope of that authority as narrowly as possible, to literally try to prevent things like an airplane full of untested or unvaccinated people from flying from one airport to another, or a cruise ship where there's been an outbreak of COVID from being able to dock until those passengers have been quarantined in some way. That's the kind of very narrow, let's see if we can prevent a worldwide pandemic by taking a few emergency measures early authority that Congress probably had in mind. But they certainly did not have in mind, in my view anyway, hey, let's just hand over to the CDC the authority to do whatever they think might marginally decrease the virulence of the latest outbreak. Whether that means shutting down all air transportation or prohibiting the interstate shipment of foodstuffs or closing down every school in the country, whatever it might be. That's preposterous.
James and I have talked about this many times in the past, that the rhetoric that we got around COVID was similar to rhetoric we've heard elsewhere, the if it saves just one life thing. What we've argued is if you push that to the limit, just force everybody to stay home 24/7. You'll save lots of lives that way. It's kind of looking like the CDC would be pushing in that direction.
Yes, but I think we keep mentioning the CDC, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't identify the real villains here, and that is Congress, the members of Congress. It is every legislator's dream to be able to fob off on somebody else all of the high-stakes, difficult decisions so that you can then claim credit when things turn out well, and you can throw blame when things don't turn out well. That is the ultimate fantasy of every legislator who was ever elected, and that's exactly what we see playing out right now.
And look at the other thing that happens. This is functionally Congress ceding its authority to the executive branch. And people don't realize that most of the bureaucracies that we have in this country sit very comfortably underneath the presidential seal. And what ends up happening? Presidents and presidential candidates keep making up bigger and more fantastic things that they can do to make that office ever more powerful. And if you look from the 1930s to the present, what you see is a relatively unbroken line of a president's office that gets stronger year in and year out.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And it is due in large measure to the fact that we have such a feckless Congress that is all too, not just willing, but happy to cede its authority to the executive branch precisely so that it can dodge responsibility, dodge accountability for the things that don't turn out well, but, at least edge into the photo op for anything that does turn out well. And Their job of Congress these days really is not much more than standing for re-election, which is, of course, the number one priority of legislators, and distributing money. I was about to say raising taxes, but of course that's not even true anymore. They love spending money. They're not so interested in figuring out where it should come from. So that's basically what they come to Washington to do, is to run for re-election and spend our money, or our grandchildren's money, as the case might be.
We're running out of time, but are you willing to give some prognosis? Where do you think this all ends up in a year's time?
I think there's every possibility of another very stern look from the Supreme Court. They might even shake their fist. And my guess would be that some of this depends on where things go with the Delta variant and some new developments in terms of whether we get a second major spike. Well, I don't know if it would be a second spike, but let's say another significant spike, and what the timing of that is. I don't think the Supreme Court would let this go on indefinitely, but there was this concurrence, this strange concurrence from Justice Kavanaugh when the Supreme Court on June 29th declined to halt the moratorium. In essence, what he said was, well, it's clear to me that the CDC is acting without legal authority, but since the current grant of authority expires in about a month, and I'm sure that they'll take these words to heart, I'm not going to vote with the other 4 members of the court to actually order them to stop enforcing the moratorium, because I'm sure they'll get their act together and stop this lawless behavior by July 31st. And of course, we now know that they didn't do that. So my guess is that Kavanaugh at least has put himself in a position where he's got to say no if and when the case gets up there. But I think it's very touch and go. I think there's a lot of cards that the federal government still has left to play. They can kind of flim and flam a little bit. They can delay. And I think the court will be willing to go along with that for some time, depending on what's going on in the country in terms of whether things get a lot worse or a lot better. My guess would be that the executive branch will try to find a way to avoid a direct confrontation with the Supreme Court in a position where they have to give a yes or no answer. If that comes, I think the court will ultimately strike down this moratorium. But I also think that the executive branch will likely be successful in engineering sequence so that it doesn't come to that. That would be my prognosis.
Clark, I'm going to ask you some probably mean-spirited questions over in the bonus material about the Supreme Court of the United States. So those of you who are on the edge of thinking about maybe joining for the bonus material, you should probably do that. In the meantime, that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. We'll see you all next week. Twitter handles are in the show notes, and you can join our Words and Numbers Backstage group on Facebook, where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, please, people, for the love of God, can't you be nice to each other, even for a minute? It's not an election year. We got nothing to be hostile about until baseball season winds down, so just knock it off. Be nice to each other. I'll see you guys soon.
See you next week, James.